This is Stand Up for the Truth, addressing important issues and topics affecting Christians across the nation.
Morning, it's Crash Kano. We are live at 9 a.m. Central here in Northeast Wisconsin. Welcome to our frequency broadcast listeners, also online, q90fm.com/listen. December 10 on the calendar, fresh new podcast. Mary Danielson is here.
Indeed. Also get that app for Q90FM, and you can just tap on it and listen live right away. We love that app. I am welcoming back Alex Newman today. He's going to fill us in on a number of issues that he watches. It's always a full hour of interesting insights with him that we can use to better interpret our complex world in light of course, a biblical worldview. My scripture this morning is Proverbs 28, 1-6. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. Because of the transgression of a land, many are its princes, but by a man of understanding and knowledge, right will be prolonged. A poor man who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain which leaves no food. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all. Better is the poor who walks in his integrity than one perverse in his ways, though he be rich. Very, very valuable proverbs we have. Let's pray together. Lord, you see everything that is done under the sun by mankind. You know our every thought and our word and our deed, and yet while we were yet sinners, you made a way for us to be reconciled to you and to have your righteousness. Give us glad hearts, Lord, joyful hearts, especially in this holiday season, that we might shine more brightly for you and bring glory to your name. We lift up those who are ill, some with seasonal illnesses, some are facing chronic illness, and Lord, they're worn down in body, soul, and spirit. Lift them up, Lord. Give them something to hold on to on their darker days. Thank you for Alex, Lord. We lift him up and his loved ones for protection, good health, and we thank you for his gifts to the body and his understanding of critical issues. And so we ask that you continue to use him and keep him safe. Walk among us today, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Alex Newman is an award-winning international journalist, educator, speaker, author, and consultant. He has written for a wide array of publications in the United States and abroad. He's been interviewed many times. Sometimes I'll catch him on the news or whatever, and I go, oh, yeah, there's Alex. He's an education writer for Freedom Project Media, senior editor of the New American Magazine, the president of Liberty Sentinel Media, libertysentinel.org. His latest book is Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, and that is a must-read for parents and educators alike. Excellent book. Alex, welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me, Mary.
Well, last time you were on Stand Up, we talked about the Rio Pandemic Preparedness Summit and their 100-day mission to accomplish their goals. Now, these globalists, they just roll merrily on, Alex, but surely I'm thinking maybe the shine is off their agenda a bit because Trump got in. I would think, if I'm a deep stater, maybe I'm going to have to lie a little bit harder to sell, for instance, the pandemic hoax or the climate hoax. Are we to understand that the battle, though, is far from over? In fact, it may have just begun. What is your take on Trump's potential deep state disruption? Is there such a thing? Is their Christmas list still intact, Alex?
Well, thank you, Mary. I think right now they're the deep staters who are absolutely determined to build this one world totalitarian political, economic, and even religious system are trying to figure out how to deal with the cards they've been dealt. They want to figure out, to use an old cliche, how do you make lemonade out of these lemons? Of course, they don't like Donald Trump. Of course, they realize that Donald Trump is a bit of a wild man from their perspective, can't be controlled, can't be coaxed into doing exactly what they want him to do. And so I think they're going to try to figure out new and improved ways of manipulating him, of throwing curveballs at him before he even takes office so that they can then try to guide that reaction. And there's a lot of good people that he's brought around him. I've followed the appointments pretty closely. I know a lot of those guys. A lot of those guys are very good, solid, God-fearing, patriotic, Constitution-supporting Americans. But there are some bad ones, too. And I can guarantee you there will be negative influences in his administration, just like there was the last time. So when, for example, a COVID comes around, you can have people like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx whispering in your ear, oh, we should lock everything down. We should. So we're going to see that again. I think we'll see economic problems. I think we'll see really significant geopolitical problems, possibly health problems. And even the global warming front that I know we're going to talk about later, he's bringing a few people into his administration that I think are serious cause for concern. There's also some very good ones on this front, but they're not going to just roll over and play dead, these deep staters. They're going to do what they can. And I think they've got a few agenda items that they are hoping they're going to be able to get passed during these 4 years that are actually critical to their agenda. They're just going to have to use new and improved marketing and talking points to get them through. I'll give you an example. Fundamental to this whole global system they're trying to build is the digital ID. And they know this system cannot work without a digital ID. So I think we're going to see, mark my words, we'll see, we'll talk again in 4 years, Mary, see if I was right. I think they're going to try really hard to push a digital biometric ID under some pretext. Okay. And they know Donald Trump's not going to be really receptive to a tyranny pretext. So it'll be something like, well, look at all these illegal immigrants running around all over the place. We've got terrorists and jihadists and spies and criminals and gangsters. We've got to find a way to track them down so we can remove them. And Donald Trump will say, hey, I like the sound of that. Or another one, voter fraud, right? We all know there's massive voter fraud all over the country. How do we get that under control? Well, a biometric digital ID might be one way to do that. So they're going to try to manipulate him. They're going to try to play him. I hope he will be able to see through a lot of these scams, but I think they're going to try to make progress on the agenda items that they can and try to hold down the fort to keep the rest of the agendas going while they ride out the next 4 years.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned possibly there are several things, the digital ID being one of them. Is there another one specifically that comes to mind that, you think that they're actually going to concentrate on? See, the American people are not so easily duped. Here's my question about that. We see what happened with COVID. There were people that actually had two brain cells to rub together, and they said, this is wrong. There's something horribly wrong here, and they got it right. What are other issues, even just one or two, that you think they're going to try to push through under the noses of people that I think are more wide awake than they might think?
Yeah, Americans are becoming pretty astute. I mean, you look at some of their fundamental hoaxes, some of their fundamental scams, like the climate scam, and the majority of Americans don't believe it. Right? They don't believe that human emissions of CO2 are causing man-made climate change. And so, and this is most Americans. Even when you throw Democrats in there, when you look at Republicans, it's less than 1 in 3. So the hoaxes that they depend on are really starting to fall flat because people know the media is lying about essentially everything. In fact, the polls show the overwhelming majority of Americans regard the media as enemies of the people. So I think one of the ones they're going to try to make progress on, we'll see if they're able to, that is the so-called conservative solutions to the alleged climate crisis. So what you see in the incoming Trump administration is quite a few people who have a background in this effort to create carbon markets, which is, by the way, a total fraud based upon a total fraud. But it's marketed as this is the conservative solution to this problem. And so the agenda is, well, it's a problem we all recognize. And so the liberals have their terrible solution that would just grow government and be anti-free market. We've got a free market solution to the problem. We're going to have carbon markets, and we'll be able to trade these things. And see, everybody likes the sound of trading. It sounds so free market, never mind the fact that we're trading nothing based upon a fraud. And you've got a whole bunch of people in the administration that are intimately involved with this process. Elon Musk is one of them. Right? As much as he's done good with Twitter so far, he has been loudly calling for carbon taxes and carbon markets for years now. You look at Howard Lutnick, the co-chair of his transition team. This is a guy whose company, Cantor Fitzgerald, is right at the heart of this effort to create these so-called carbon markets. Another big one, and this gets into a little bit of esoteric stuff, but we have a crisis when it comes to the debt that is beyond what anybody can even fathom. I mean, $40 trillion in debt, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And we're coming to a point here very soon where people are not going to keep buying these ridiculous treasury bills, right? This is the most indebted entity that has ever existed in the history of humanity. And, of course, they're dismantling our economy, our ability to pay back that debt, as they're stealing all our money. So this is really a pickle. And so they've got this incredible scam. We don't have to go into all the details, but they're issuing and by the way, again, Howard Lutnick is involved with this. They're issuing these things they call stable coins, like Tether. And they're backing these with U.S. Treasuries. So suddenly we found a brand new market to pump these piece of garbage U.S. Treasury securities into now that the Japanese and the grandmas with the pension funds have enough sense to not want to buy these pieces of junk anymore. So these are the types of things where it's relatively obscure. Your average Fox News 30-second soundbite person is not going to be able to understand this.
That's right.
And hey, Trump's the president, so we can go back to watching our football, right? We don't need to worry about all that complicated stuff. Trump's got our back. So I think they're going to try to move on these things. But, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I think Trump is a really significant threat to the deep state's agenda. And depending on how things shake out here, we could see some major progress setting them back. For example, undermining the United Nations. They've got a plan B. They've got new institutions that they think can take up the slack if Donald Trump ends up destroying the UN. But those are the types of things I see coming over the next 4 years. But I do think they're going to throw some real monkey wrenches into the gears here. Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum has been talking for years about a poly crisis, maybe a World War III, maybe an economic collapse, a collapse of the dollar, another public health pandemic, you name it, a cyber pandemic, as Klaus Schwab says, all these things converging into one. And that would really throw Trump's agenda off kilter, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And Harari said that their agenda has nothing to do with U.S. elections. So that's how they're comforting themselves in all of this. I know crypto is on the rise, and as soon as the election was over, the value of crypto went up quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because is it just confidence in the market? Because crypto has been really, really up and down the last several years. Bitcoin reached a new high, and then it just really tanked, and then it reached an all-time high. Is it just confidence in the market? Is there something more going on? Because I know blockchain is connected to global IDs. So what do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and I don't know how much time we have. I'll start off by saying, full disclosure, I own some crypto, and of course it has done very well. I started buying Bitcoin back in like 2010, I think, when it was $1 a piece. So I would have hundreds of millions of dollars if Mt. Gox hadn't collapsed and somebody ran away with all my crypto.
Me too.
So that's a little bit of a sore spot. But
Same here.
Right. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of us in that boat, right, who had Bitcoin early on and who no longer do have those Bitcoin. Yeah. So that's unfortunate. But I think something very profound and very sad has happened with Bitcoin. The original vision of Bitcoin was permissionless transactions. And this was really revolutionary, right?
Yeah.
Right now, when you go to use your credit card, when you use money, interact with the economy in any major way, you've got to get permission, even if you don't see it, from banks. You've got to get permission from governments, right? And this applies even for cash, right? I mean, try to take $10,001 across a border somewhere and see what happens, right? It's not as simple as just put your cash in your pocket and walk across the border. If they catch you, they'll take it from you if you don't disclose it. You got to tell them where it came from, what it's going for. So even with cash, you need permission to be able to interact by people who, by the way, produce nothing, right? Bureaucrats, politicians, etc. And so Bitcoin was supposed to revolutionize that. This was supposed to be a way for us to be able to transact with each other without any banks, without any government getting in the way. And that worked for a while before certain things happened, where now that has really been undermined. They want Bitcoin and a lot of these other crypto things now to be seen not as money, not as a means of exchange, a medium of exchange, but rather as an asset, a digital gold, which is about the most preposterous thing I ever heard. And so this is all very strategic. This is all by design. So I think the deep state power brokers allowed this kind of free market in crypto, if you will, so that a lot of people would spend a lot of time, energy, money developing these technologies, figuring out what worked, allowing the market to choose, which was the best option. And now we're in the hijacking phase. There's a very wealthy individual named Roger Ver who is being ruthlessly persecuted by the U.S. government right now. He was one of the early Bitcoin bros. Some people even blasphemously call him Bitcoin Jesus, which is a term I really don't like. But the U.S. government has just ordered him to be arrested. He's over in Spain. And he did a book that was released this year called Hijacking Bitcoin that gets into some of the nuances of this. He's going to be on Tucker Carlson very soon here, so people should watch for that interview.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be very enlightening.
Yeah.
But what they have tried to do here is eliminate Bitcoin's usefulness as a medium of exchange and turn it into this kind of asset that they'll be able to integrate into the globalist slave state that they're building. And so It's very unfortunate. I'm not telling people to invest or not invest in Bitcoin. I'm just, stating honestly here what has happened with Bitcoin. It is not what people originally hoped it would be anymore. Yeah. And if the establishment gets its way, it will never be that again. Right now, you want to buy Bitcoin on exchange, you got to comply with a KYC. They know your customer, so they want to be able to track every little bit of this, and they've made it very, very impractical to use in exchange. So that's all by design. And I think a lot of these technologies, I don't know if Bitcoin will necessarily be involved directly, but a lot of these technologies are being used to restructure the global economy, not just with carbon taxes, but what they want to do is tokenize every single asset, including things you didn't even realize were assets, like your national parks, and put these digital tokens on an international blockchain ledger that the Bank for International Settlements is developing. And I know for people who aren't familiar with this stuff, it's going to sound like Chinese, but they're creating this international blockchain ledger where every asset in the known universe they hope is going to exist on in tokenized form. And then if you want to be able to interact with that ledger, if you want to be able to buy or sell on it, you're going to have your digital ID, you're going to have your digital currency. It's all going to be tracked. It's all going to be regulated by the central banks of the world, by the international financial institutions, and by the political class and the mega banks. So that's the direction they're moving, and we could get into more depth on that, but it is a nightmarish situation that really brings Revelation 13 to mind, where you won't be able to buy or sell if you won't accept this mark.
Wow. So. Well, and having followed this since, probably about 2016, and just the origins of these digital currencies, you buy all these computers, you spend, $5,000 a month on your electric bill, and you mine Bitcoin based on algorithms and finishing puzzles and all that. Alex, when I first heard that, I went, okay, I'll never be able to wrap my head around this. This is crazy. But I was immediately thought this is the wave of the future. When I heard about the blockchain, every transaction can be followed around the world in real time. It can't be hacked. I mean, this is an amazing technology, but I am not surprised at what you're saying, because when people get their hands on things, they ruin it all eventually. So that's how that works. Thank you for that insight. And also, what was the gentleman's name who's going to be on Tucker Carlson?
Roger Ver, V-E-R, Roger Ver.
Okay.
And he's very well known in crypto circles. He was one of the early adopters of Bitcoin. He went around the world promoting it, has been battling the U.S. government for a long time. The ATF came after him after he talked about how they incinerated a bunch of women and children at Waco. So I think he ended up in federal prison for 10 months. He gave up his citizenship. Very interesting fellow. And he really understands this stuff in a way that few other people do in terms of how the elitists, the deep staters, were able to hijack Bitcoin and really kind of turn it 180 degrees away from what it was intended to be, which was a decentralized way of conducting economic transactions toward being just another part of this diabolical machine. Interesting.
This is Stand Up for the Truth. My name is Mary Danielson. We're speaking with Alex Newman today, libertysentinel.org. Alex, I want to talk about this UN Climate Summit, COP29. And it's interesting because as I watched the speeches and all the campaigning between the two candidates, I don't remember any of them mentioning the climate in any of their speeches. And if this is such an alarmingly imminent threat to the rest of us, why was it not an issue? I think Americans realize it's a deep state interest primarily, not domestic. So that I thought that was kind of fascinating. But you were correct at this climate summit in Azerbaijan?
I was, yes. I flew to Baku and spent almost a week. It was crazier than anything anybody could imagine. And you're right. Your average American doesn't even know that this happened, and that is by design. Right. Again, to go back to the polls I cited earlier, the establishment knows that Americans don't believe this, and there's nothing they can say at this point that's going to make us believe it, right? It's not like CNN tomorrow is going to have some breaking news story and people are going to say, oh, you were right, CO2 is dangerous, we need to pay a carbon tax to the UN. Never going to happen. No. Never going to happen. We're the bitter clingers. They know that, so they figure, let's just do this all in the background. We'll brainwash their kids, we'll ignore the adults, and within a generation, this scam will be able to materialize because we'll have brainwashed the children. They won't be able to think critically. Wow. But they've given up on us, and they know that the more they talk about it, the more Americans get uppity, and the more they call their congressman, the more they tell their governor, hey, don't allow them to do that stuff in our state. So their policy right now is just radio silence. Don't talk about it loudly so that Americans don't know. And by the way, they commit fraud on us on a daily basis with these things. Exhibit A is the Inflation Reduction Act. When you go to these things, they're all running around bragging about how, we suckered those stupid Americans. We passed the biggest climate bill in history. We just called it the Inflation Reduction Act. Those morons, I can't believe they bought that. I mean, that's how they talk. They really think that we are idiots to be played. And I'll tell you what, Mary, if a business had done what the Congress did with that Inflation Reduction Act, all those people would have gone to jail. They would have been arrested for fraud. If they say, hey, this thing cures your cancer or your inflation, and it actually gives you cancer, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act did. It poured jet fuel on the fires of inflation. A businessman would have been arrested for that. Congress calls it politics. It's the same reason why you didn't hear anything about this climate fraud summit on the fake media.
Wow. I mean, to me, it almost, global governing costs a lot of money. And this is, to me, like a telethon for globalist causes. That's what this is. But, what are these schemers up to? Spending, 1.3 trillion a year in wealth transfers? And there are a lot of buzzwords here, but wealth transfers is just one of them. Climate reparations, climate market. Kind of take us through some of those, because when I hear it, my eyes kind of glaze over. I don't really know what that means, and I think that's probably by design, obviously. But what's a wealth transfer?
That's just another way of saying thievery, robbery, larceny.
Highway robbery.
Right?
Yeah, right.
That's that thing that God said all the way back in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not do this, right? That's that.
Okay.
And also coveting, right? Well, you guys have more stuff than we have, and so we're going to make up some very fancy story about why you need to give it to us by force if necessary. So the simple way to understand is this is just thievery. They're going to steal $1.3 trillion from what's left of the middle class in the United States and the Western world and transfer it to third world kleptocrats, the UN, and all these various programs that they want to use to enslave humanity.
Wow. That's a lot of money. Climate reparations. Is this related to taxing meat and dairy and that sort of thing for the so-called damage they allegedly do? Is that what climate reparations are, or is it something else altogether?
Well, climate reparations is a term that they came up with some years ago. And here's the thinking, Mary. You terrible Americans, your forefathers invented the modern world. Right? They created refrigeration and airplanes and engines and transportation and modern medicine, and all these things that make life possible, that liberated us from backbreaking labor, that extended lifespans by 50 or 60 years, that allowed child mortality to drop to the floor. How terrible of you to do all those things. Don't you realize that because of that, you emitted carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide causes climate change, and so give me a lot of money, is basically the way that works. So they're arguing that because America and the Western world, what used to be known as Christendom or the free world, industrialized, that we put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. That CO2 is supposedly causing climate change, and therefore anytime there's a hurricane, a drought, a tornado, a fire, a flood, you name it, tsunami even somehow, then that's your fault. And so you now need to pay for it because your ancestors blessed the world with all of these wonderful inventions that make the modern world possible. So it's an incredible fraud, Mary. It is a dangerous fraud. And it all depends. I think it's important to say this for the people who aren't really following this as they should be. It all depends on the fraud that carbon dioxide is pollution. And I just want to put that in context real quick. Carbon dioxide is the gas that you exhale. Right? About 2 pounds of that every day comes out of your mouth and nose. Human emissions of carbon dioxide make up a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% of all the so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So even if you believe the greenhouse gas theory, and there are peer-reviewed studies suggesting that it is not legitimate, but even if you believe it, human contributions to that are so tiny as to be basically insignificant. And I've interviewed hundreds of scientists about this now, Mary, including some of the most prestigious scientists in the world, dozens of scientists who've served on the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Nobody said it better than Trump's climate advisor, Dr. Will Happer, in his first term. He's a physicist at Princeton University, a great man and a great scientist. And he told me on camera, the world is starving for more carbon dioxide. It is the gas of life. We should be encouraging people to make more of it. Plants, he said, were designed, which I thought was an interesting word. They're designed to live in an atmosphere with 4 to 5 times as much CO2 as we currently have. That's why farmers pump it into their greenhouses. And so this whole idea that it's dangerous, that it's toxic, that we need to pay the UN taxes to make the temperature of the planet perfect is so utterly ludicrous from a scientific perspective. You can bet these deep staters are laughing all the way to the bank as they marvel over how they were able to convince some significant segment of humanity to believe the gas they exhale is toxic.
Wow. And we know already whose pockets this money lines. But we don't get a progress report, Alex. When the global temperature goes down a degree, there's no dancing in the streets, like those fundraising thermometers, only this one's going down instead of up. It sounds silly because it is silly, but there's no human who's going to follow up on this and say, well, is it working? Is it working? You say in one of your articles here, UN climate deal okays carbon markets and trillions in reparations. And out of that 1.3 trillion, 300 billion annually will be in the form of grants and low-interest loans for these reparations starting immediately. And this represents a tripling of previous pledges. And the rest of the funding will come from government-backed investments, quote-unquote, and potential new international taxes, ding, 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 there it is, on fuels or aviation in the years ahead. Carbon taxes on us poor lowly humans who are giving out carbon when we get up in the morning. So, this is, what a scam. The COVID scam was bad enough, and a lot of people have died from that. But this is right up there with that. And these climate activists, Alec, I want to ask you about this, because I think it was mostly 2023 we'd hear about in Amsterdam or wherever these climate people would go in the middle of the road, they'd lay down, and the drivers who need to get somewhere, we're losing their minds over this, and rightly so. But they're not just fringe protesters, is that right? They're funded by wealthy Western governments. These are staged protests.
They're absolutely staged protests. It's ironic because at the UN they call them NGOs, which stands for non-governmental organizations. And a lot of them, you go to their website and they'll tell you right there, we are funded by the government of the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Sweden, the Foreign Ministry of such and such government. Sure. It is truly a spectacle to behold. And there's even more nefarious elements to it, too. Like, take some of these U.S. green groups, for example. We found out, actually Congress found out a few years ago, that the Kremlin, the Russian government, and its state-owned energy company, Gazprom, was funneling huge amounts of money, tens of millions at least, to a shell company in Bermuda called Klein Limited. And this Klein Limited was redistributing that money then to an entity in the United States called the Sea Change Foundation. Well, the Sea Change Foundation was shoveling millions of dollars in grants out to all these crazy left-wing masquerading as environmental groups. And this all came out in the congressional record. Right? They wrote letters. They wrote reports about this. And so I asked all these people about it. I asked the activists. I asked the Russian government. Nobody wants to talk about it. So you have all these nefarious sources. And ironically, the Russian energy industry, which is owned by the state, is funding anti-energy protests in the United States. Why would they be doing that? Well, it's pretty obvious, geopolitically speaking. Another major source of the funding for this nonsense is the Rockefeller dynasty.
Oh, yeah. They're behind.
Those who remember the Rockefeller dynasty? It's an oil dynasty.
They're everywhere.
Right? That's where they got their money.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's happening here, Mary, that people need to understand is, why would the oil interests want to fund this stuff? Well, for one, they want to stop their competitors. For two, they're hoping to make a whole bunch of money. This latest climate conference was sponsored by a whole bunch of big banks and big oil companies. They think they're going to get rich trading these fraudulent things called carbon credits. So that's the next big scam, as we started talking about earlier on in the program.
Wow. Well, and a more recent, I don't know how recent this is, but this Extinction Rebellion, that's one group, and they were protesting in the Netherlands against the Dutch bank, ING, because they were supporting fossil fuels. And so they can always find a reason. They can always find a rabbit trail. They can always find a connection of things that they don't like. And my understanding is they're never satisfied with the outcomes of these conferences, Alex. They always want more. No, that's not enough. We want more money. We want more action. We want more solutions. We're saving the world from itself, so you've got to pony up. They have these every single year. It's just going to get worse and worse. We've got a break coming up, but when we come back, I want to talk to you about your major takeaway from this, because I can't imagine what it's like being at one of these things and seeing all these people and listening to their presentations and all of that. But when we do come back, I want to talk to you about your impressions of it, just watching, just being a fly on the wall of something like that. I can't imagine what that's like. We're talking to Alex Newman today. This is Stand Up for the Truth. And we're talking about the climate conference that he was at recently, and we're going to continue to talk about the Trump cabinet nominees. We're talking about maybe Trump ending the Department of Education. We'll see what we get to in the next half. Stay with me.
Thank you so much for sharing today's Stand Up for the Truth video podcast. We invite you to check out our other headline news site, ctrnn.org. That's ctrnn.org.
Feedback, questions, and topic suggestions are always appreciated. Email us at comments@standupforthetruth.com.
Welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth for this Tuesday. It's December the 10th, and we're speaking with Alex Newman today. Always a full hour of information. I love hearing what he's watching. And he was at the COP29, the UN Climate Summit, and their massive telethon, their highway robbery. I want to ask you two things, Alex. I want to ask you, what's your biggest takeaway from that? And then also, what is this group of 77 plus China? I think this probably has something to do with climate change. I don't know. But either one of those things, tell us your thoughts about that.
Sure, happy to do it. So I think the big takeaway from the climate summit is actually that they, for the first time ever, agreed to international rules for the UN's carbon markets. And that did not get a lot of press. In fact, you would be very hard-pressed to be able to find it in the American media at all. Sometimes it was like, a little footnote at the bottom of an article. Oh, by the way, they agreed to the global rules for the UN carbon market, as if it was just, and nobody wants to ask, what does that even mean? Because nobody wants to sound stupid. This is profoundly significant, folks. The carbon market is an effort to fundamentally restructure our entire economic system. Right now, you are rewarded for producing things, or at least you used to be. Right now, you're rewarded for buying politicians who will then steer tax money to you. But back in the day, in the good old days, when we had somewhat of a free market, if you produced goods and services better than your competitors, you were rewarded with money. And so that kind of made the world go around. Everybody was competing to try to make better goods and services, cheaper goods and services, better processes, more efficient processes. Now, if this crazy carbon scheme gets its way, it's going to be flipped on its head. You will be rewarded for not producing wealth. In fact, you might be rewarded for destroying wealth. This sounds almost too crazy to believe, but it's exactly what's happening. They'll say, for example, buy a big forest. And then they'll say, well, we're not going to chop down the forest, and therefore we get 1,000, just pick a number out of thin air, carbon credits, and now we can go sell these to people, to governments, to companies, even though we were never planning to chop down the forest in the first place, but because we could have hypothetically chopped down the forest and we're not doing it, now we get a bunch of carbon credits. So the reward now is to lock up more and more wealth, more and more productive assets. This is a recipe for global poverty. This is a recipe for centralizing all power and control in the hands of the people who control the rigged carbon market. So this is a scam unlike anything we've ever seen. You might even say this scam rivals the creation of the Federal Reserve, right? Where they're basically printing money out of nothing, loaning it to you at interest, never creating the interest so that you can never get yourself out of debt. Scam of unbelievable proportions. This carbon market that they're building might even rival that. That's how significant this is. Wow. So it's not going to be that, next week you're going to be paying carbon taxes. You're going to have to buy carbon credits from Al Gore if you want to get on an airplane. But given enough time, if nobody stops these fraudsters, if nobody puts them in jail where they belong for defrauding humanity, that is the future for your children and for your grandchildren and for your great-grandchildren, if you're fortunate enough to have any, because did you know children produce huge carbon footprints?
Yes, I suppose. I suppose. Wow. Thanks for putting that in terms that we all need to hear as far as the magnitude of this kind of scam. It's just, the emperor has no clothes, and the Federal Reserve, money doesn't exist anyway. It's all on what you can exchange for it. So, and that's a whole other subject. So, wow, thanks for letting us know that. And also, I'm looking more towards, and I think they're already doing this, they're tapping religions to provide the guilt portion, because there's no guilt like religious guilt. I haven't heard much from the globalists regarding to getting the faithful to get behind this pyramid scheme, but climatism is a cult with its doctrine of guilt and its eschatology of gloom and doom. Greta Thunberg, she is their high priestess, and she handles the anger portion of the program. The Bible addresses this in Romans, those who worship the creature rather than the creator. But getting religions to sign up for everything from world peace to vax ID cards and 15-minute cities, I'm guessing is also a priority. You got to get the Christians, borderline pew warmers or the more those that really adhere to what the Bible says, getting all of those on board via a leftist kind of theology. That's part of this, isn't it?
It is an integral part of this. This whole scam actually depends on that. So let me talk about that because that's something I've focused on a lot. In 2022, I went to Egypt for the COP27. They hosted it on the Sinai Peninsula, very strategically.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was there covering it for the New American. Actually, my cover story for the New American when I got back was the UN's New World Religion. For me, that was the main takeaway. And you wouldn't read this in most of the fake establishment, dishonest, lying propaganda media, but that was the big takeaway for me. So right before the conference started, the UN put out a report on human development. And what they said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit because I don't have the words in front of me, but they said the old systems of ethics and morality that emerged over thousands of years of evolution are no longer suitable for taking care of Mother Earth. And the reason why is they didn't have this focus on preserving the environment. And of course, it was a direct shot at the Ten Commandments. Yeah. So to solve that, you had all these religious wackadoodles of all different types. You had every kind of pagan. They flew in a bunch of Indians from the Amazon with the headdresses. Wow. They flew in a bunch of Hindus. They had a bunch of alleged Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, Muslim leaders, imams, rabbis, pastors, popes, etc. And they actually unveiled, and for those of you who haven't followed this, it's going to sound unbelievable. They unveiled a new and supposedly improved Ten Commandments. And they walked up to the top of Mount Sinai in an incredibly blasphemous ceremony. And the guy who was helping to lead this thing whips out the new and improved Ten Commandments, painted green, and goes on a rant about governments need to do more to save us from climate change. Rah, 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 rah. And then he smashes these tablets, right? I don't know if they realize the irony, right, with what actually happened on Mount Sinai with Moses and the syncretism and the worshiping the golden calf. I don't know if they saw that irony. Maybe it was calculated to do that. So they all rallied around this new and improved Ten Commandments. And then I went at the bottom where the UN conference was being held, about an hour or two away from what they say is Mount Sinai. I think there's good evidence that that wasn't the real Mount Sinai, but whatever. I catch up with the organizers of this thing, and they're desperate for media attention because the American media is not paying any attention. Hey, could I have an interview? Oh, yeah, sure. So I get to sit down with four of these clowns for about 45 minutes, and they're very sincere. And one of the guys, the CEO of the Peace Department, one of the co-organizers of this blasphemous ceremony, says to me on camera, not just the Ten Commandments that we're coming up with, now we're working on a third covenant. And we're going to use this third covenant, he said, to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So God gave us the original Ten Commandments. The UN and Friends has the new and improved Ten Commandments. Wow. God gave us the old covenant, the new covenant. Well, UN and Friends has the new and improved third covenant so that we can build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And so when I say that religion is integral to this, I mean that in the most serious sense. They see this, and they have said so publicly, as a three-legged stool approach. So the first leg of the stool is, of course, governments. The second leg of the stool is, of course, business, the private sector. Third leg of the stool is religion. And so what the UN calls the Master Plan for Humanity, this was adopted in 2015. The Pope was there to bless the whole ceremony by the General Assembly, was what they call the Sustainable Development Goals, or the 2030 Agenda. Impacts every area of your life, the brainwashing of your children, your health care, your land rights, your farming, your business, everything. Right?
Wow.
And so the first leg of the stool, every national government in the world signed on to this 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Economic Forum, representing the second leg of the stool, the businesses of the world, signed a strategic partnership with the UN for the global implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The third leg of the stool, the religions of the world, have now formally embraced the 2030 Agenda. In 2019, a group called Religions for Peace, it's basically a UN front group funded by your taxes. The lady who runs it, Dr. Azza Karam, says this is the UN of religions. All religions, all faith traditions are part of this. I've got her on camera saying this. Okay? So they come together in 2019, and all of them join together. They sign a statement, and they say, we commit to development as set forth in the UN 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development Goals. And so they all now, governments, businesses, and religions, walking in lockstep for this one world satanic system. And I ran into Eric Solheim just a few weeks ago in Azerbaijan. He was the head of the UN Environment Program when they came up with the Faith for Earth initiative. And I asked him about this. I wanted to test his Bible knowledge. Why do Christians need to support this? And people can go watch this interview. He starts blabbering about the Bible. And it was so obvious. The guy knew nothing about the Bible. He says, yes, and the end of the Bible ends with a great flood. It's like, no, actually, no, it doesn't end with a great flood, Mr. Solheim. So that's why people need to part. So people can watch that for themselves. And what you need to understand, when this lady says all religions are part of this, they mean that.
Yeah.
If your Christian denomination is not a part of this, they regard you as an extremist, as a cult, as a sect that must be destroyed because you're standing in the way of human evolution, of progress in protecting Mother Earth. So again, I can't emphasize how significant this religious angle is to this whole global diabolical scam.
Wow, very interesting. And we have watched so many churches in the last 5 to 10 years go over to the leftist theology, Black Lives Matter, social justice gospel, woke theology, dominion theology, which plays right into this. Also, this time of year, of course, they always tell us Jesus was a Palestinian and Joseph and Mary were homeless, and so then they run off on that. So this isn't really all that surprising, but it is, of course, very, very grievous. But narrow is the way, broad is the way that leads to destruction. And so we've been warned that there would be a broad way of destruction, especially in these last days. Wow. I want to move on to the Trump transition again and also the Department of Education. But Alex, I want to ask you, what's your one takeaway just being there, experientially just being there? What was that like? What was your biggest takeaway in looking at all the people that attend this and knowing what you know? Let's put it that way, knowing what a huge scam this is, and you're coming in with a spiritual perspective.
Well, it is diabolical. I hope people understand that. We know Satan is the father of lies. This whole thing is based on lies. Therefore, this whole thing comes from the pit of hell. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. As you pointed out, they do this every year, and every year they have a big ask, and every year they make more progress. Every year they come up with a new agreement. The big takeaway out of this year's agreement, the $1.3 trillion is significant, especially when you realize they're destroying our economies, and we're not going to be able to afford that $1.3 trillion. But the big takeaway is that they've now got the rules in place for the UN's global carbon market. That's the most significant element of this. Okay. Next year they'll come back, and there will be, actually next year's summit is going to be hugely significant. It's going to be in Brazil, and God willing, I will be there. But they're making massive, massive progress while Americans are focused on football, while Americans are focused on other things. And if we don't stop this scam, it is going to underpin a global satanic system that will be worse, darker, more wicked than anything you can imagine. And I think it's hard for people to understand that because it's like, it's just the dumb kids protesting climate change. Yeah, they're dumb, they're silly, they probably were brainwashed, but it's not that important. It's hugely important. So I would urge people to focus on this. If your pastor is preaching on climate change, you ought to have a talk with him. And a simple way to get that started is just educate yourself on these things. There's a lot of information out there. Actually, the UN announced a new partnership to censor any climate misinformation, which is the truth about climate. Sure. So it's going to be harder and harder to find this information. Find it now while you still can, because they're going to try to disappear all of our voices so that only their lies and propaganda can be heard.
Wow. Wow, an amazing subject. We are headed for enslavement, especially if they go forward with these 15-minute cities and such, which it sounds like nonsense to me, but they're serious about it. So thank you so much for your insights on that, Alex. I want to go back to the Trump transition. It doesn't have to be long here, but you've interviewed some of these people, some of the appointees, because they cut across the Washington grain. We're still processing this, but Trump is a businessman. And so we're not going to get necessarily politically motivated people returning favors that they've, garnered over the years, saying, hey, put me in your cabinet because you owe me one, that sort of thing, which drives me crazy. But I think the highest profile appointees might be RFK and Tom Homan, because these are really important issues. The border is super important. And the Americans' health, because we're spending a small fortune on health, and I think that our food is trying to kill us. Have you interviewed those two gentlemen? And what was your takeaway with them?
I have, yes. I've interviewed Robert F. Kennedy. I've interviewed Kash Patel. I've interviewed Tom Homan. Actually, the guy nominated for the DOD has interviewed me. very interesting fellow, Peter Hegseth.
Oh, yeah,
So
Peter.
I know some of these guys, and I think of the ones that I have interviewed, they're really solid. They're really, really good choices. RFK, I wish he was public in defending the life of unborn children, especially because HHS has so much sway over abortion policy and spending on that. But I think he is going to bring something very unique to the table, and that is a hostile stance toward these wicked interests, including the big pharmaceutical companies and the big food companies that have been poisoning Americans. And I think a lot of Americans hear what he has to say, and they think he's exaggerating, that maybe he's got like a vendetta. No. He is, if anything, understating the seriousness of this wicked, wicked system that has been foisted on us when it comes to our health. So I think he's the right man for the job here. I wish he would come out very publicly in favor of defending the lives of the unborn.
Yeah.
But on the vaccines, on the food, on the agriculture, on the toxic chemicals, we are being poisoned in America.
Absolutely.
And Robert F. Kennedy is the single most important voice in exposing that.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why Americans are some of the least healthy people in the world. It's because we are being deliberately targeted. Our children are being deliberately targeted. So I am really, really looking forward to what RFK is going to do. He's going to face some very, very serious headwinds. There's a simple formula how you can know who are Trump's best nominees. The ones who the media hates the most, right?
Yes.
The ones who they shriek about the most, the ones who the rhinos pretend to have concern. Oh, I'm concerned. So when the rhinos and the fake media are attacking, we got to rally around those people because those are the best ones.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned Tom Homan as well. I think Tom Homan is the right man for the job. He's got the experience. He's worked in all these bureaucracies. He's serious about enforcing immigration law, getting our border under control. The globalist agenda depends on destroying borders. The globalist agenda depends on moving millions and ultimately billions of people around so that there no longer are nations anymore. And, from a biblical perspective, it was God's idea to divide mankind up into nations.
Right.
And if you don't believe me, go to your scriptures. Deuteronomy chapter 32, right? Acts chapter 17. Over and over again, God tells us he divided mankind into nations. That was his design. So when you see evildoers waging war on nations, waging war on family, waging war on the church, you know that this is coming from a position of evil. And so I'm looking forward to see what Tom Homan will do. He's a great American. I've shared the stage with him many times at events around the country, and I'm very glad that Trump nominated him. Borders is not really a constitutional position, so we'll see, what exactly that means.
Yeah.
But I'm hopeful that he's going to play a major role in immigration, customs, etc. So we should be in prayer for these guys because they're going to face a lot of attacks in the weeks ahead. They're going to face all kinds of almost certainly false accusations, and so be in prayer for them.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we have these industrial food processing complexes, industrial pharma, we have industrial everything, and especially the food, the ultra-processed food, which Americans have been gradually introduced to. Maybe they don't cook anymore, and maybe this is just a whole lot easier because they're so busy, but it's killing us. And the Salmonella and E. coli recalls, Alex, I've never seen anything like it. I open up my news every single day, and I'm telling you, several times a week, there are in our either restaurant supply chain or just the grocery store supply chain. The most recent one is lettuce and cucumbers at Kroger. I mean, you can't even go buy a prepared salad anymore without wondering what you're putting in your stomach. Do you think, I got to know, do you think that there is some kind of design here? Why all the salmonella? Why all the E. coli, except breaking food processing laws? And it should not go well. It shouldn't because it's not real food necessarily. Do you have any thought on all these recalls?
I do. I think what we're seeing here is a war on farmers. And the effort is eventually supposed to culminate in the absolute destruction of independent food producers. They don't want family ranches. They don't want family farms anymore. They want all of it controlled in an industrial, genetically engineered, right? You need to understand that genetic engineering is not just convenience. It's not just more profit. They want to own the intellectual property of your food. They are patenting the genetic material in your food. Okay. So this is an effort to ultimately, and they say this openly, transform food systems. They want to move all the independent farmers and ranchers off their land and have all food produced by a tiny handful of mega corporations. This is not just in America. This is around the world. I've been on this story for over a decade. They are doing everything possible to destroy farmers and ranchers and to get all food production in the hands of huge government-connected mega corporations that will patent the DNA of your food, that will poison you through your food, and where every iota of food will be completely controlled, completely regulated. And if you don't comply, it's not like you'll be able to just go down to the farmer's market and, trade with your neighbor for some eggs or whatever. They want to make it so that you are utterly and completely helpless without being able to participate in the system.
Absolutely agree. And we're talking corn, wheat, and soy, the GMO products that are in everything now. Whether you want corn, wheat, and soy in everything now, it doesn't really matter. Seed oils, all those things. Tucker Carlson, by the way, did some great programs on that. It's worth looking into some of his exposés on the food system. We got about 5 or 6 minutes left, Alex, and I know that education is very dear to your heart. The book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. So much great history, great context in that. I know we've discussed it in the past on the show. I think framing a lot of issues in light of Trump's influence is a constant exercise in rethinking, and in a good way, of course. But one of the things he mentioned, the first things, he wanted to end the Department of Education. Legislation has already been filed. I wasn't aware of that. Others have wanted it gone since Reagan. What would it mean, Alex, to put an end to the Department of Education? Are we talking about getting things back into the state's hands? And how does that filter down to our darlings in the schools who are being raised as global citizens if you're talking about 7 hours a day with a government-mandated system? So what is the benefit for mom and dads that are listening in on getting rid of the Department of Education?
Well, that should really be a no-brainer, Mary. There's no constitutional reason and there's no pragmatic reason why the federal government should have any role at all in education. Right? And this is a very simple constitutional process. Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers of Congress. All legislative powers are reserved for Congress. Any powers not delegated to the U.S. government are reserved for the states or for the people, as it says in the 10th Amendment. Therefore, the federal government should not touch the issue of education. I don't believe states even ought to be involved in education, but hey, that's a subject for another day.
Yeah.
And so now this question of shutting down the Department of Education, that should be a no-brainer. We never should have created one. Right. Anybody who suggested one should have been asked, what part of the Constitution do you think authorizes any federal role for education? But I will say the deep staters, the establishment toadies, are already coming out of the woodwork, and they're coming in to save us from the Department of Education with totally fraudulent solutions. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota has already filed a bill. It is a fraud of a bill because what it does is it redistributes all of these functions of the Department of Education to different agencies. So the Treasury, the State Department, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services. So that actually just makes it even harder, right? You turn the light on, the cockroaches scatter, and they all go live in other agencies, and then we can't even track all the wickedness that they're doing. His bill wouldn't reduce federal spending on education by one single nickel. So that means it wouldn't reduce federal influence over education by a single nickel. So this bill, I think, needs to be called out for what it is. It's a fraud. It's an effort to hijack what Trump promised to do and neutralize that threat while acting like they're doing something. And I noticed that bill got a lot of media attention, all the fake media. Oh, look, there's a bill to abolish the Department of Education. Where were they 8 years ago when Congressman Thomas Massie introduced a great bill to end the Department of Education? By the way, that bill is still introduced in Congress. It's got 33 Republican co-sponsors. It shuts down the Department of Education, and it doesn't redistribute the functions of the Department of Education to other agencies. So I question the motives of all these dishonest propagandists and the fake media who suddenly discovered that there's a bill to shut down the Department of Education when they should have been talking about Thomas Massie's bill. I interviewed Thomas Massie, congressman from Kentucky, about this maybe 6 years ago, and he had excellent reasons why it needed to be shut down. I encourage people to check that out.
Okay.
So, yes, we need to shut down the Department of Education. Donald Trump should lead that effort, but we should not be misled by bills like Senator Mike Rounds that would actually preserve the status quo while pretending to do something about it.
Wow. Sounds like a Hegelian bill from hell. And you can't overestimate the damage that this department has done since, I think, Jimmy Carter, one of the worst presidents in history. Data collection on students, DEI, hires woke indoctrination in the schools, sex ed, leftist indoctrination. I mean, they have done plenty of damage, and the kids, of course, are the ones, and their psyches are the ones that have absorbed all that. Would that affect the labor unions? I mean, and I'm talking about the education unions. They have never cared about the best interest of the students whatsoever. So forgive my ignorance on how all this works and what they all do, but would that affect, if they dismantled it, any of the labor unions or the day-to-day stuff that undermines parental authority?
Well, dismantling the Department of Education in a real sense would make it harder for these wicked, big union leaders to impose their grotesque vision for humanity on our children. And that's a good thing, right? Then they would have to fight state by state. And they would have a tougher time in Oklahoma and Nebraska and South Carolina and Idaho and Montana than they would using the U.S. Department of Education to impose this on us. So it would be a very positive development as far as reining in and limiting the power of these, in many cases, Marxist and wicked big labor bosses.
Okay. Very, very interesting. I guess if we're going to find a silver lining with COVID, it would be a renewal of homeschooling. And I think, and also discovering what school boards are actually about and what they're actually up to. I think that is possibly the one good thing that blew it wide open. But again, turning our kids over to 7 hours a day of mandated government schooling is never a good idea. Our expectations should be low. And a lot of this started in the 70s, teaching evolution, sex ed, political indoctrination. So, wow, Alex Newman, so much. I love, you just call a spade a spade. I never have to ask you, what do you really think about that, Alex? And I'm so grateful for that, because the climate hoax, we knew it was a hoax, but now we can put a dollar sign with that. So thank you so much for your time today, and God bless your Christmas and time with family and all that, and hopefully we can catch up with you in 2025.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary. Really appreciate it. God bless you. Keep up the good work, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Sounds good. Tomorrow, Terry James, replay. Thursday, Carl Kirby is back with us. And Friday, Patricia Engler of AIG, Answers in Genesis. We're going to talk about Marxism. Very, very interesting. She's one sharp girl. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Thank you so much for joining me today. See you again on Thursday.